Hello, hello. Hey everyone, thank you for having me. So I have some slides, I'll go through them pretty quickly, but I really want to make this an interactive session. So I'd love if you have questions. I'll talk a little bit about what we see as success in B2C as well as B2B. But honestly, there's more data on the B2C side that I can share. Most of the B2B side is kind of private, so I couldn't make slides. But you can ask me, and I might be able to tell you something, okay? Sorry. So who am I? I am the co-founder of the Venture Reality Fund. We are an early stage VC based in Silicon Valley, but investing globally in VR, AR, and generative AI. We have over 100 million under management. We've now looked at over 9,000 startups in the space, invested in over 55. Some of our most successful companies include Rec Room, which is the first software VR unicorn, Epic Games, everyone knows, makers of Fortnite, Beat Games, which is the makers of Beat Saber, the most successful VR game of all time, Alchemy Labs, which is another very successful VR game studio that was acquired by Google, InWorld, which is a leading generative AI engine for NPCs, Virtualytics, which is one of the leaders in data visualization and analytics using XR tools, and then Apprentice, a pharmaceutical manufacturer in XR. All of these companies, again, highly successful, and then we've had exits to Google, Meta, and Apple through our portfolio. So XR market overview. I want to talk about the consumer XR market right now. So we're seeing an install base of about 40 million units. That's between the Quest, the Valve Index, and PC VR ecosystem, and then the PSVR 2 and the Sony ecosystem. App Store revenues are over $4 billion. This represents the consumer spend on the different app stores, the Meta Horizons App Store, which is the Quest App Store, the Steam VR App Store, and then the PlayStation VR App Store. And then, like we mentioned earlier, top B2B VR companies, or XR companies we're seeing, are now surpassing 10 million ARR, and even some are surpassing 20 million ARR as well. And so I will say, investment is down from a 2021 high, but that is across the board in all ecosystems except for generative AI. And that we're still tracking about over $1 billion will be invested in the XR space this year. The most important thing that's been happening in the past year was really that we're seeing this Gen 3 wave of XR devices. We're finally seeing mixed reality in them out there in the main field. Vision Pro launched. A lot of people never thought the day would come. A lot of people thought it would come much earlier. But Apple did release their Vision Pro. And anyone that's tried it will know there's definitely a lot of trade-offs. There's definitely a lot of things that, it could be lighter, it could be less expensive. But if you put that on the headset of someone and they do the immersive dinosaur experience, I have yet to see anyone not believe that spatial computing is the future. And so I think it's very important that we have someone that's trying to go mainstream at $500 or less, which is Meta, and then someone that's going to be aspirational and show what an unlimited budget, how great XR can be. So now I want to focus a little bit more about App Store sales. So we saw, again, in software sales alone, primarily game applications, right? These were the 3 different app stores, yellow being the Meta Store, now called the Meta Horizon Store, red being Steam, and then blue being PlayStation. And again, the majority of the revenue is from the Meta Store. And that's really because of the success of the Quest. You can see when VR first launched, pretty small, and then the Quest 1, and really it was the Quest 2 that was a huge success, and of course COVID. But you could see that the market is huge. So looking at the Quest Store in particular, Quest, about 30 million devices sold between Quest 3, Quest 2, and now of course there'll be the Quest 3S coming out shortly. But what's really interesting is this. Over 200 titles have made over $1 million in revenue. Most of those games actually had budgets of less than $1 million, so they're profitable. Now, more importantly, 46 titles have done 10 million, and over 5 million have done over 100 million in revenue. Right? And the top title has done over 200 million in revenue. So right now, the most successful game by, not by revenue, but by active users, is this game called Gorilla Tag. And if you're unfamiliar with it, it's a social VR game where you play by moving with your arms. So they call it gesture locomotion, right? And the core is you're with your friends, you're playing, very popular with the younger crowd, developed by a single developer. Meta was so confused by the game, they refused to let it into the App Store, so it was stuck in the App Lab for quite some time. But it's gone on to generate over $100 million in revenue, and now has 1 million daily active users in VR alone. Solo developer. So this is what success can look like, you know? And so now let's take a look at broader spectrum. Like what are we seeing? Top performers based off lifetime revenue. Top 25 games present about 60% of lifetime revenues. What are the criteria for success? What have we seen? The most successful games are indie games, not AAA, not coming from the big players, but indie games. And why do they win? It's because VR native mechanics. Some of the most popular games are physics-based combat, physics-based locomotion, or gesture-based locomotion, gesture-based gameplay. So really embracing the six-DOF controllers and having the most moment-to-moment fun you can have. So big IP and AAA game studios struggle. Subscription and IAP are becoming viable options. Sequels don't succeed. Mixed reality has yet to succeed. Social and multiplayer games have always been successful, but now, especially like Gorilla Tag and the Gorilla Tag-like games, are become extra successful. Embodied gameplay, so third-person platform games, there are a few of them. None of them, aside from maybe Moss, have been super successful, and even Moss, I would say, is marginally successful compared to some of the big hits that we're seeing here. Yeah, and here is a list of the most revenue-generating games, I think, in rough order, with Beat Saber being the top, and then Blade and Sorcery being next. But you can kind of see what's really interesting about this is what type of game and type of interaction really wins in XR. So now I want to talk a little bit about B2B success. And again, I can't get into too much details because none of this is really public information. But again, areas that we see XR startups with over 10 million ARR are in the training sector, healthcare sector, manufacturing sector, data analytics sector, and product design sector. So a lot of these are 3D spatial tasks. And I think what I really want to call out is really, this does not require mainstream adoption. The hardware is good enough that you can come up with those use cases that really need or showcase why VR is necessary or XR is necessary. And solutions have to do the impossible to drive adoption. I'll give you an example. So the previous presentation was fantastic, talked a lot about training, but really we feel like the opportunity of healthcare is not just training. Training is good. But what's great is when you're actually using XR tools in the surgery. So we're talking now about surgical navigation. And what are the outcomes that we're seeing? With these surgical navigation tools using VR, AR headsets, doctors can now perform potentially error-free surgery for certain procedures. So there's spine surgery, orthopedic surgery, and one of the companies, they're called Proprio, in clinical tests right now, like clinical trials, but they're seeing that doctors are having zero, error-free surgery, which is unheard of. Right now, the state of the art is 50% error rate. 50% of the surgeries have to be redone at the expense of the hospitals, and again, at the risk of the patients. If we can eliminate that, then adoption of XR tools isn't a maybe, possibly. It would actually be inhuman not to adopt that, right? So that's what I mean by what XR can solve these impossible tasks. And I think the number one thing I see when I have a startup that comes to me, especially in enterprise, they're like, oh, we have something, and I'm like, well, what's the ROI? What's the main benefit of this? What is this worth? And I'm like, oh, it's a little bit better. It's 10% faster, 10% savings, maybe like hundreds of thousands per customer, maybe $1 million per customer. That's like, no, you have to think billions. You have to think world-changing. But what's great is, especially now with things like the Apple Vision Pro, you can now actually start creating those experiences that could do those things. Okay. So now I did want to turn it over to you guys. Hopefully you guys have some questions. If not, I can keep talking out of my butt, whatever you guys prefer. Oh, I did want to have two more facts about enterprise. One thing to note too. So Tailspin was an enterprise training company in VR, just got acquired by Cornerstone, which is one of the biggest players in like general employee development. So now they're going to bring VR to their 7,000 customers, which represents over 125 million employees. So understanding, again, XR is going to scale in a big, big way across multiple factors. And then we're seeing a lot of use cases, right, for XR that are going beyond just traditional gaming. We're seeing, of course, fitness being a huge opportunity. We're seeing a lot of other areas, too, where XR adoption is growing. Okay, so again, any questions? Yes?
So it's important to, thank you. So during a pitch, right, it's important to have a workable tech demo to show what's the investor that the product's like, or we can just have a very detailed proposal, or whichever is more appealing to the investor.
So it depends on who the investor you're talking to and how much money you're asking for. Like, are you very early stage? Like usually, if you don't have a demo yet, you're pitching just an idea to like an angel investor, like a rich uncle or auntie, and then you'll get the money to build out the prototype. Once you have the prototype, then you can come and talk to a seed or pre-seed investor with a working prototype, and then you're still before market fit. You do that, you get the money to kind of get your customers, you do your seed round or your pre-seed round, and then once you start actually getting traction, getting customers, kind of getting closer to like $1 million in revenue, and $1 million ARR, like recurring revenue, then you can talk to more bigger investors about your like A round. That's typically the scales that you go. But what I would say is this: yes, build your demo. Build your demo. Absolutely build your demo. Because the most important thing is you need to impress the investors. And honestly, we get a lot of people talking all the time, and it's like I'm 1,000 times more impressed by someone that's builds it and can show me, because it's never the idea, it's always the execution.
Hi, thank you. I'm Josephine. I build an app using augmented reality to know who is who around you. I'm also based in San Francisco, and I wanted to ask you if you think that generally we know that not many investors are excited about AR or XR. So do you see a change in the trend in that?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. So I will say this: the majority of investors right now are only interested in generative AI, right? But the most interesting thing is, like, investors are more interested also too in solutions being solved and real revenue and real user traction. So if you can say, hey, you know what? Like, it doesn't matter if it's AR or VR, but we have a growing community of users and we have retention of like 50%. Day 30, yeah, people, I don't care what you're doing. Like, yeah, I want to talk to you, right? So, but you're right. I think the days of leading in with like, hey, we have AR, we have VR, or we have something for on the Vision Pro, like, that's not that interesting. But I think that's also a maturity of the market as well, because now, like we said, like, there are companies that are succeeding, and so if you're going to go to a company investor and say like, hey, give me money, I have an idea, I have a rough prototype. Well, it's like, well, these companies that are succeeding are asking me for money already too, so I probably would rather give them money as well. So that's also how I would think about things, how the market has changed. Yes?
Yeah, I got a two-part question. So I wanted to ask if you have been also looking at numbers that are not direct from the App Store, like, for example, SideQuest.
Yeah.
So have any of them showed traction that are not in the mainstream
Sure.
App Store? And the follow-up question is, what about platforms like SideQuest, because they provide alternatives as opposed to following all the regulations that you need to follow from the main app store, like all the app stores, and they could be gems that could be undiscovered from there.
That's a great question. And again, Gorilla Tag is a great example of this. So Gorilla Tag was not allowed into the main app store, so it's only on App Lab and SideQuest for about a year. And I believe they did, I want to say it was $5 to $10 million just on the App Store, or just on the App Lab, before they had actually graduated into the main store. But Meta has made a change now, and so now everything in the App Lab is now searchable on the main store, and so there's no longer as much of a distinction between the two. And of course, SideQuest is great. There's a good ecosystem there. There's good community. It's a good way to get people to find your app. But at the same time, the main store is where most of the money is. And the biggest opportunity, right? Like, when it comes down to it, it's all about distribution, right? And how do you market and how do you get people to download your app or in Quest? And that's primarily by being featured in the App Store, right? The second way is to get like TikTok views, right? All right.
Yes.
Any other questions?
Yes, right here. We want to know what's your prediction in the future in terms of growth for this market.
For which markets?
We show us a prediction on the XR market and how it's growth from
Sure.
2019.
Sure.
What's your prediction or forecast regarding that, like post 2024? If you what's your prediction?
This is a tough question, right? Like I feel like predictions are usually just never right. But what I will say is this: like we see or we expect pretty steady growth, not exponential growth, until something big happens, right? So right now, what we're seeing in the XR market is steady growth. We'll probably still stay in like the tens of millions of devices with like slow growth for the next couple years until we see something major happen. And that could be either a great new game that comes out that drives adoption in a big way. It could be a new form factor where it's lighter, more accessible. Again, there are some people that was hoping it would be mixed reality. I don't think that will be the thing. There's also people that are like, oh, have a big bet on Apple and not the Vision Pro, but when they release the Vision Air or the Vision S, right? Like that will be maybe another big inflection point. But that might not necessarily be for gaming. That might just be more for like generalized spatial computing. But that will probably be the biggest inflection point in the market. And so looking at those things, we're like, okay, can we get to, say, hundreds of millions of headsets? I would say we are waiting for that moment when Apple releases their next big device, or if Meta does a really big breakthrough on their next device, right? Like those would be the big two inflection points, and that would happen either like 2 to 3 years from now or 6 years from now. And that's when we'll start getting into the 100,000 headsets. But what I will say is, even in the tens of millions of headsets, huge fortunes can be made for relatively small budgets, okay?
Hello, I just have a quick question about wowing investors, to use your term. How early or how polished would you like it to be? For instance, should we present it to you when it's kind of a pretty rough prototype, or should we wait like 6 more months when it's a little more polished?
The more polished, the better, honestly. And also, too, like, we have to think about, like, what are you raising money for? How much are you raising? That always kind of, like, factors into the math, right? Of, like, okay. But, again, I wouldn't stop until it wows you, right? Until it wows someone. If it's rough and, oh, my God, you can still see the magic, okay, that's amazing. But if you need more refinement, it has to be that thing where people look at this and they're like, hey, this needs to exist in the world, right? Like, that's it. I mean, the other way I would think about this too, and this is more for like gaming and softer things, is like putting out a teaser trailer, showing that it goes viral on YouTube or TikTok or whatever, right? Like finding some way of getting some kind of social proof or excitement about your idea before you've fully built out a functioning prototype will be the other way you could try to get investor attention. Okay? Please.
So do you see any traction in content creation sector?
Any traction in the content creation sector? So you're talking about like tools for creating content?
Yeah, tools for creating content,
Yeah.
and also actually studios or companies who want to create content.
So there are a couple, like, so Gravity Sketch is the most successful like product design VR tool, so content creation as being like product design and 3D models there. There's another called Shapes XR. It's really pretty popular for like prototyping. They're kind of Figma of XR. But I get pitched a lot of times this idea of like, hey, we're making a tool that lets you make XR easier. Like, it's web-based or it's using generative AI, and now you can create this XR content so much faster, so much cheaper. But a lot of times I'm like, well, that XR content you're creating is garbage, and no one would pay for it, right? So what I would say, if you're making a creative tool, you have to validate that tool in the marketplace, right? So like, if Toy Story wasn't a success, no one would care about Pixar Render Man. Or if like Unreal Engine, like if Unreal Tournament wasn't a huge success, no one would care about the Unreal Engine, right? And so you have to show your tool is amazing. If you're like, hey, we made Gorilla Tag, we made Beat Saber, and now we're gonna hand over the tool so you can make things like that, yes. But if you're like, hey, we've created another tool that lets you drop this 3D model in the scene, go F yourself.
Yeah, hi.
Yeah. Sorry. You can see I'm getting a little hangry. Sorry.
No problem. What are your views on crypto and the metaverse in the future?
Stay away.
Stay away.
Stay away.
Okay.
Stay away. Crypto is not the metaverse, right? Like, I will say this. Web3, I think there's some interesting uses of it, but man, it's become this like toxic cesspool of like badness because of a lot of, because it's unregulated and because there's a lot of bad actors in there, right? And so I would just say, at least for me, when I see something like, I would say like, it's hard to do great XR. It's hard to do great Web3 crypto. Like, focus on one thing or the other. I haven't seen much really positive synergy between the two. All right, last 5 minutes, so let's go. Anyone? Sure.
Hello, I'm from DealVR. We are a 2C VR video streaming platform.
Okay.
And I want to ask if you see any opportunities in this track, because for now it's just Meta Store. They pay Meta TV. They pay for like big studios to shoot.
Yeah.
And for Apple, they shoot their own immersive videos.
Yeah.
So is there opportunities for third party like us?
So 360, 180 video, stereo video right now, at least at the quality that we've seen, hasn't been very compelling. People only pay for porn. That's the only thing. So I would just challenge you to say, can you find an avenue where there's a certain type of content that people would pay for, right? And you can't expect it to be paid for by the platforms. You can't expect it to be ad-driven. It can't just be about item. It has to be good enough that the content itself, that the user will say, hey, you know what? I'll pay $1 a video, or I'll pay for a subscription fee because I think this content is valuable. Now, I would argue up until the Vision Pro, I hadn't seen any kind of 180 stereo or 360 video that anyone would pay for aside from porn. But now with the Vision Pro with Apple, they have this like, visual fidelity, they have like the production value where there is content that maybe people might pay for, but it's uncertain. I do feel, though, that going volumetric and not using I don't want to throw any companies under the bus, but not using the similar technology that Microsoft used to use, but using something based off Gaussian splat that was really, really impressive, that might move the needle. But with the current technology at the current resolution and the current subjects, I haven't seen any success there. And I would suggest, again, just trying very hard to find what kind of content people would really pay for. And it could be something more on the lines of like streamers and just figure out, can you create a better experience? Is 180 stereo streaming better than 2D streaming, right?
Yeah, just over here. Just wondering if you've had any information about LBE, if it's returned since COVID, and if theme parks have actually started to embrace the technology.
Okay, honestly, I will admit I'm pretty ignorant on this part, but that's also because none of the revenues have been super significant. I think, again, the one Sandbox has done somewhat well, and they talked about numbers of play, but they never talked about how much revenue it's actually generated. So I'm kind of like, well, I will say it's not a drop in the bucket of the $4 billion that's being spent in the consumers. So if I was an XR startup right now starting from scratch, I wouldn't care about LBE. I wouldn't worry about LBE. I wouldn't do anything in LBE. That's not to say LBEs can't be successful. They can be, but at the same time, you always have the trade-off of what's the cost, right? Like how much does it cost to create, to run and operate an LBE? There's so many other factors that that could determine your success that are outside of your business, like a global pandemic or something like that, So, yeah, I don't know. I'm not a fan of LBE as a business model, but that doesn't mean it can't be. I would just say this. I have a hard time believing that LBE is a venture scale opportunity, but it could still be a good opportunity for smaller companies. Last question, sorry.
Hi, my name is Ryan from Indonesia. I'm Spectralisium.
Okay.
We are using a volumetric video to scan all the traditional dance of Indonesia and martial arts.
Awesome.
We already got a commitment from the government to do that.
That's fantastic.
So they're going to pay for the system, and then they're going to deliver to 53 million students of Indonesia. Would that be something interesting for VCs?
It would be interesting for a VC if you can say, hey, those students paid X amount of money for a subscription, or hey, they retained and they use this once a month, and we have good metrics based off that. But off the general premise, I would probably say not.
Okay.
But I do think this is like an interesting category. And if you could say, hey, like for me, as a VC, I'd be like, okay, well, what's the business use case of that? Like, cultural enrichment is important, like as a human being, but as an evil VC, I have to think, okay, where's the real dollars here? What's the business opportunity?
Yeah, there's it.
Okay, I think that's it. I'm out of time. I'll be outside if people want to ask me more questions. Stay in contact with me. Follow me on X. I'm at Tipatat, Tipatat. I hope this was helpful and informative. Thank you.